Some legends don't walk with spotlights, they sit quietly in the shade. Harrison Ford hadn't flown in years, not in public, not where people watched. But one blistering afternoon in Santa Monica, he unfolded a chair at the edge of a runway and waited. He said nothing, wore no name. But by the time the F-22 broke formation, the entire airfield had already turned to look. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and if stories like this still matter to you, make sure to subscribe. The sun hung high over Santa Monica, casting sharp lines across the concrete and steel. It was Airshow day, the kind that pulled in families with strollers, veterans with medals, teenagers with cameras, and pilots with posture. The static displays gleamed in the light, flanked by folding tents, loudspeakers, and booths selling everything from American flags to freeze-dried astronaut ice cream. Kids ran around in mock flight suits, waving souvenir programs like mission orders. Engines roared in the distance as the first demo team prepared for launch. Everything was perfectly choreographed, everything accounted for, almost everything. He arrived without noise. No entourage, no fanfare. Just a man in his late 70s, maybe older, wearing a worn-out bomber jacket with a faded patch on the sleeve, carrying a folded lawn chair and a canvas pack. He moved slowly, deliberately, his shoes well used but polished. The kind of man who knew how to walk without being noticed. He passed by the security checkpoint with a soft nod and a flash of ID that looked decades old. The young guard glanced at the card, then back at the man. Something about the face seemed familiar, but the line was building, and protocol doesn't leave room for intuition. "Sorry, sir, this section's reserved for VIPs and invited veterans. The general viewing area is that way." The man didn't argue. He just nodded once, turned without complaint, and continued walking. He made his way to the far edge of the field, beyond the tents, past the family zones, just before the perimeter fence. He found a quiet spot near a line of retired cargo containers and unfolded his chair. No shade, no crowd, just a view of the sky unobstructed. He sat down with his back straight, hands folded, and eyes fixed on the runway. For several minutes, no one noticed him, just another old man at an air show, but there was something odd about the way he sat, too composed, like a man who wasn't here for spectacle, but for memory. One of the volunteers walked by, offering cold water to guests. She paused for a second, glancing at the patch on his jacket. It wasn't the typical air show souvenir. It was old, real, the kind stitched in before branding became fashion. She almost asked him a question, but hesitated, then moved on. Over by the operations tent, a young officer scanned the grounds with binoculars, running a routine security check. His gaze swept past the seating, past the vendors, then caught on something at the fence line. A man sitting perfectly still, like a statue dressed in canvas and leather. The officer blinked, adjusted the focus, then moved on. Probably just a retired mechanic, maybe a volunteer's grandfather, and that was it. No one approached, no one pointed, no phones came out. He wasn't on the program, he wasn't on the list. He wasn't supposed to be anyone important. But he sat there like the sky owed him something, like he'd come not to watch, but to wait. What they didn't know, what no one there realized, was that the man by the fence had once flown through storms few would survive, had once landed in places maps forgot, had once made choices that haunted even the quietest mornings. What they didn't know was that his name had once commanded rooms, not because he demanded it, but because he didn't. And what no one said, least of all him, was that he was Harrison Ford. But today, that name meant nothing. Not here. Not to him, not yet. The jets were already tracing patterns in the sky when the boy wandered away. Maybe 8, maybe 9, all elbows and curiosity, ducking under the rope line, while his father negotiated with a vendor for a commemorative patch. The boy didn't run. He moved like he was following something he couldn't quite explain. Past the tents, past the photo booths and souvenir stalls, all the way to the fence where a single man sat alone, quiet, still, like the world behind him had no sound. The boy stopped a few feet away. The man didn't turn. His eyes stayed with the sky, tracking the tight formations above, 4 jets in a diamond sweep, peeling into a high roll, then flattening out in synchronized flight. The boy looked up too, then down at the man, then up again. "Did you ever fly one?" the boy asked, voice just loud enough to be heard over the whine of engines in the distance. The man blinked once, slowly, then finally turned. His face was lined, wind-worn calm. "Not those," he said with a hint of a smile. "Mine were older, slower, and didn't fly for show." The boy squinted, trying to understand. "You were a pilot." There was a pause, not long, just enough to let the moment settle. "Yeah," the man said softly, "that's what they called it." The boy sat cross-legged in the grass without asking. For a second, they both looked back up. Another pass, tight, loud, clean. A cheer rippled through the center stands, far behind them. The boy didn't move. "Were you ever scared?" he asked, almost like he wasn't sure if it was okay to ask. "When your plane, was in trouble?" The man didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened just slightly. His hands, still folded over one knee, didn't move. "Yes," he said at last, "I was scared." The boy waited. "But fear," the man added, "doesn't help you hold the stick. Doesn't keep you level. You learn to fly through it, or you don't fly at all." The boy didn't reply. He didn't have to. Something in the way he looked at the man changed. Not awe, not hero worship. Just understanding, deeper than his age should have allowed. A voice called from back near the tents. "Eli, come on, bud." The boy stood slowly, brushed the grass from his shorts. "Thanks," he said, then added, "I think you flew the cooler ones anyway." The man smiled again, barely. "You might be right." The boy jogged off, disappearing into the crowd. At the far end of the operations platform, a young lieutenant watched the exchange through a pair of field glasses. He hadn't been looking for anything, just surveying the perimeter, checking lines, making sure no one crossed into restricted space. But something about the boy sitting cross-legged and the older man beside him had caught his attention. Not the conversation, he was too far to hear that. It was the posture, the stillness, the subtle weight in the way the man looked at the sky, as if he wasn't watching planes at all, but something deeper, older, and far away. The lieutenant lowered the binoculars and frowned slightly. He had no name to go with the face. But something about that man by the fence felt off, not wrong, just not ordinary. Some part of him, deep down, told him to remember that face. And he would. Inside the operations tent, the air was clipped and focused. Radios crackled low across the table, a dozen monitors buzzed with camera feeds, and the logistics team moved with quiet precision. Flight timing, crowd control, emergency protocols, everything down to the minute. Outside, the roar of jets rolled in waves across the tarmac. Inside, it was all order, until one officer stopped moving. Lieutenant Daniels had been scanning the east perimeter for unauthorized movement. Standard procedure. Most feeds showed happy families, camera flashes, sunburned tourists. But on camera 12, something pulled at him. A man, alone, older, sitting at the far fence line in a folding chair, not moving, not eating, just watching. Daniels adjusted the zoom, sharpened the contrast. There was nothing alarming, no badge, no equipment, no weapons, but something about the man's presence felt intentional. The camera wasn't close enough for facial ID, so Daniels switched to an archived drone pass recorded earlier in the morning. Static, heat shimmer, then a clear freeze frame, the face. He leaned forward, eyes narrowing. He knew that face. Or thought he did, not from a military file, from somewhere else. He opened his tablet and ran a quick cross-check using public recognition software, civilian grade, not military issue. It took less than 20 seconds. Then it pinged. A match, name Harrison Ford, age 81, profession, actor, producer, licensed pilot, FAA certified, known for multiple solo flights. Notably survived 3 forced landings between 1999 and 2017. In 2015, performed an emergency landing on a golf course, saving his own life and preventing civilian casualties. Later commended by local aviation boards. Maintains low public profile, no social media. Rarely grants interviews, no record of prior attendance at air shows as guest or honoree. Daniels stared at the profile, then looked back at the screen. It didn't make sense. Why would he be here, unannounced? Alone, no escort, no press. No sign of recognition. "Sir," he called out, gesturing to a nearby senior officer. "You might want to see this." The captain stepped over, read the profile, then looked at the paused camera frame. His brow tightened. "That can't be right." "I double-checked it," Daniels said. "It's him. But he's not on any list." "No, sir, he didn't register, didn't request access, he just showed up." The captain looked at the still image again. Harrison Ford, Han Solo. Indiana Jones, that Harrison Ford. "Yes, sir, but more than that. He's logged over 2,000 hours of flight time, known in the aviation community, quiet, keeps to himself. And that's him sitting by the fence." Daniels nodded. The captain didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he turned to the control panel. "Pull up his FAA record, not the Hollywood stuff, the real logs." Daniels tapped through a few layers of secure databases. The files weren't classified, just obscure. And what they revealed wasn't entertainment trivia. It was pages of flight reports, solo navigation through storm cells over Montana, voluntary medical delivery runs in rural Alaska, and one line buried deep in a debrief. Subject executed a precision forced landing after engine failure near Los Angeles. One passenger aboard unconscious. No fatalities. Subject declined media interview. The captain leaned back. "That man has saved more lives in the sky than some pilots do in a career." Daniels swallowed. "What do we do, sir?" "Nothing," the captain said. "Not yet. If he came here quietly, it's because he wanted it that way. No cameras, no speeches, just a seat." Daniels hesitated. "Should we at least notify Air Protocol, the flight team?" The captain didn't answer right away. He looked back toward the east perimeter, even though the man was far beyond eyesight. Then he spoke, low and even. "Keep eyes on him, don't alert the press. Don't send anyone over, just, let's see what the sky decides." The operations tent had grown quieter, not silent, but careful. Conversations shifted to lower tones, eyes flickered more often toward monitor 12. The man on the feed hadn't moved. Still by the fence, still watching the sky, still invisible to almost everyone except those who had started to notice. A cluster of junior officers gathered near the logistics table. The captain stood nearby, arms crossed, as Lieutenant Daniels gave a quiet update. "He hasn't left his seat, not even once." Someone else leaned over. "If it's really him, shouldn't we say something? Invite him up to the stage." "He's not wearing a badge," another replied. "He didn't ask to be seen." A voice cut through the room, slower, graveled, like it hadn't been used much outside hangars. It belonged to an older man in an oil-stained flight vest, leaning against a supply crate with a coffee he hadn't touched. No rank visible, just experience. "You all are young," he said, "too young to remember the Wyoming rescue." Daniels turned. "Sir." The man nodded toward the screen. "Back in 2001, a student pilot lost power over a mountain pass, crashed hard near a state road. Fog was thick. Took emergency crews almost an hour to even locate the signal. By the time they arrived, the kid was already out of the wreckage, stabilized, airlifted by a vintage Bell helicopter that shouldn't have even been flying in that weather." The captain frowned. "Medevac." The old man shook his head. "Civilian, one pilot, no crew, just came in low, touched down between two highway lanes, loaded the boy, and lifted off before anyone got a name. Local paper said the pilot looked familiar, but nobody confirmed it. No press release, no interview." He pointed slowly at the still image on the monitor. "That's him." The tent went quiet again. Another officer, mid-30s, spoke up. "My father served in NAM. MACVSOG, flew out of Saigon the last night before the fall. Said a civilian pilot jumped into the chaos with an unregistered bird, no markings, just to get a final group of intel guys out. Never knew who it was." He looked closer at the screen, expression tightening. Could have sworn he once said the guy looked like Han Solo. No one laughed. The captain finally spoke. "Some people serve with their name on every wall, others. They serve without ever wanting one carved." Nobody responded. Outside, the sound of another formation pass echoed through the tent, sharp and clean. The man by the fence still hadn't moved. Still didn't know or didn't care. that inside a tent filled with brass and data and chain of command, his presence was changing everything. And he hadn't said a single word. The crowd had gathered in full now. Every seat taken, every camera lifted. The announcer's voice rang across the field, polished and practiced, drawing attention upward. Ladies and gentlemen, prepare your eyes to the sky. The United States Air Force F-22 Raptor demonstration team is ready for takeoff. Applause rolled through the viewing stands like thunder. Children climbed onto shoulders, old veterans removed their caps, and the sky above Santa Monica seemed to pause in anticipation. Then came the roar. One after another, the Raptors screamed down the strip and into the air, rising in perfect harmony, locked tight in formation. The diamond pattern unfolded like a precision-drawn arrow, carving the blue with machine elegance. The crowd erupted. Phones captured every second, every roll, every sharp-angle turn. For a moment, the spectacle stole every eye, except one. Far from the main bleachers, beyond the flags and announcers' booth, on the eastern edge of the tarmac, the man in the old bomber jacket sat exactly as he had for the past 2 hours. Upright, focused, silent, Harrison Ford didn't lift a phone, didn't move a muscle. His eyes tracked the Raptors like a man reading a language only he still understood. Inside the operations tent, Lieutenant Daniels stood next to the captain, both men watching the feed and the sky. Captain Morgan, lead pilot of the F-22 team, had received no new orders. There was no mention of deviation, no change to flight path. But then, something shifted. At the top of the third loop, just before the synchronized brake, Raptor 1 moved. Not much at first, just a degree off pattern, subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough. The announcer's voice caught for a second, confused. We're seeing a slight variation, from the standard maneuver, ladies and gentlemen, nothing to be concerned about. But by then, people were already turning. Raptor 1 had peeled away. Not erratic, not off course, intentional. It descended slightly, breaking off from the diamond and lowering altitude. The crowd gasped, not in fear, but in awe. The jet wasn't heading toward the centerline or the stage. It was banking east. Toward the fence, toward the man in the chair. Daniel's voice was tight. "Sir, he's breaking formation." The captain said nothing. No one called it in. No one stopped it. Raptor 1 leveled out at a low pass, barely 50 feet above ground, engines softened, wings tilted. The angle wasn't dramatic. It wasn't theatrical. It was graceful, deliberate, a quiet salute that needed no explanation. And beneath it, Harrison Ford finally moved. He didn't stand, didn't wave. He simply raised one hand, placed it gently over his heart, and looked up as the jet passed directly above him. A shadow swept over his chair and was gone. There was no roar, no thunder. Just that moment, the silence between sky and earth where something real settled in. The kind of moment you don't plan. The kind that just happens once and never again. The other 3 Raptors completed the maneuver as scripted, rejoining formation and finishing the demonstration with perfect precision. But no one cared, not now, because something had shifted. People began to rise. Not in excitement, but in stillness. Near the bleachers, a junior airman removed his cap, then another. Near the stage, a Marine veteran placed his hand to his brow and held it. Even the announcer didn't speak. The script meant nothing now. The man by the fence remained still, hand over his chest. He didn't look around. He didn't acknowledge the silence swelling behind him. But somehow, everyone knew. He wasn't just watching planes. He had been waiting. And the sky had remembered. The jets had long since landed. The announcer's voice had gone quiet. Vendors were packing up banners, folding tables, and bins of unsold memorabilia. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, asking for one more photo, one more patch, one more story. The crowd, once buzzing with energy, now softened into a slow scatter. But near the eastern fence line, the man in the bomber jacket still sat, unmoved. Then, slowly, Harrison Ford placed both hands on the arms of his chair and stood, not with flourish, not with ceremony, just with the steady grace of someone used to standing on his own. He reached down, folded the chair in a practiced motion, clipped it to his pack, and swung it over his shoulder. His gaze stayed forward. He didn't look behind him. As he turned to leave, The wind lifted gently across the field, catching the edge of his jacket. The old patch on his shoulder, sun-faded and threadbare, seemed to flash just once in the afternoon light. Not many recognized it. But one did. A young cadet, barely out of the academy, stood a few paces ahead, jaw tight, hand trembling slightly as he raised it in salute. No words, no questions, just a gesture of respect. Harrison met his eyes, nodded once, then kept walking. He passed a group of officers who had been watching from a distance. One of them, a colonel, straightened his uniform, stepped aside, and stood at full attention as the old pilot moved by. He didn't speak either, but the gesture was clear. Rank meant nothing today. Further along the path, a wheelchair creaked as it shifted. An older veteran, seated alone near the back line, placed both hands on the armrests of his chair. With effort, with slow, unshaking determination, he lifted himself up. Not fully, not easily, but enough. Enough to stand by will if not by strength as the man walked past. And still, Harrison said nothing. No one asked for a photo. No one called out his name. He wasn't the actor. He wasn't the legend. He was simply a man who had come to watch the sky. He reached the edge of the field where a service vehicle idled near the perimeter gate. The driver stepped out, unsure. "Need a ride, sir?" Harrison nodded, climbed in, chose the seat furthest from the window, sat without a word. And then from somewhere behind them a sound, soft at first, a single clap, then another, and another, no chants, no cheering. Just applause, quiet, measured, honest. It rolled across the tarmac like a ripple in still water, spreading from cadets to commanders, from spectators to staff. Not for the air show, not for the planes, but for the man who never asked for recognition and yet made the moment unforgettable. He didn't turn to look, but he heard it, and that was enough. The following year, the air show returned. Same field, same roar of engines, same tents lined in perfect rows. Families arrived early, staking out shaded seats. Veterans wore pressed uniforms and polished shoes. Children ran with plastic wings and wide eyes. The announcer's voice welcomed them all back to Santa Monica. The schedule hadn't changed. The formation times were exact. The Raptor team was ready. Everything looked the same, almost everything. At the far eastern edge of the tarmac, just before the fence line, one folding chair sat alone. Not in the VIP section, not under a canopy, just there, open to the sky, placed with quiet care. On the seat was a worn flight cap, faded green, its edges curled with time. Resting on top, a handwritten note pinned gently to the fabric. It read, "For the one who never asked for recognition, because the sky remembers." No name, no signature, no photograph. And yet everyone who saw it seemed to pause. Some walked by without a word. Some stopped, hands behind their back. One cadet whispered something no one could hear, then stood at attention for a full minute before rejoining the crowd. No one needed to explain it, not really. Throughout the day, the chair remained untouched. People instinctively walked around it. Volunteers refused to move it. Even security kept their distance, like it had always been there. Like it belonged. When the F-22 demonstration team prepared for their finale, the announcer hit the familiar rhythm. The crowd leaned forward, cameras lifted, phones readied. 4 Raptors screamed into the sky, climbing in a burst of force and grace. The crowd cheered on cue, but as the jets rounded the final turn, something subtle happened. Not a break, not a loop, just a shift. Raptor 1, lead in the formation, adjusted its heading by the smallest margin. Barely a few degrees, the pattern still held. The crowd wouldn't notice unless they knew, unless they were looking at the far fence line, where the chair sat, where the cap rested, where the note waited. As the jets passed that edge, Raptor 1 tilted slightly, not showy, not dramatic, just a quiet, level dip. A salute made of steel and precision, held for exactly one breath, then gone. No one said a word. Backstage in the ops tent, the flight logs were entered like always, maneuvers, altitude, fuel data. But under deviation, someone wrote, "Pilot discretion." No questions were asked, and the chair stayed there. Every year since, the flight cap gets replaced when the wind wears it thin. The paper note has been laminated now, not for protection, but because someone wanted it to last longer. No one knows who first brought it back. No one needs to. New cadets hear the story from older ones. It's passed around not as fact, but as something deeper, a moment, a memory, maybe even a myth. And every year when the Raptors take to the sky, those who know where to look still find it. That slight dip, that exact heading, that quiet pause in the middle of power and noise, they don't announce it, but the sky still remembers. And for a man who never asked to be honored, that's all he ever needed. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.